There's lots of social media influencers out there who will talk about adultery from time to time. Sometimes they will interview people about adultery and what should be done about it, how society should deal with it, things of that nature. Some of these social media influencers are people like Esther Perel, Sharon Pope, Rich Cooper, Chris Williamson, Allison Armstrong, Bettina Arndt, Pearl, Oprah Winfrey. There's dozens more. There's a whole bunch of them out there. Some of these social media influencers are extremely famous people. Some of them are not so famous, and the rest are somewhere in between. From what I can tell, from all of these many different social media influencers out there, I've yet to come across a single one of them who very seriously discusses the possibility of just making adultery to be illegal. They talk about how it's been around for decades and centuries of time. It causes so much pain and misery. It's such a bad decision for people to make, all this, that, and the other. But they never talk about, well, why don't we just make it illegal? Why can't we do that? Hello, everyone. My name is Marvin. I'm the creator of the Family Adultery Law. If you don't know what that is, watch this video. It's about 14 and a half minutes long. Family is spelled F-A-M-L-I, family. This video explains the 5 foundations of the family adultery law and how they work, and how the family adultery law will be a big step forward in preventing adultery from ever happening at all in the first place. A lot of these social media influencers and just it seems like everybody else in the world makes this assumption that you cannot make adultery to be illegal. It's got to be legal. For some reason, I'm not sure how that happened, but that's the case. And so whenever anybody talks about adultery and gives advice, marriage counseling advice, or anything else, it seems to me as if they do this from the point of view that adultery has got to be legal. You cannot make it illegal. So because it has to be legal, here's what you do. You get prenuptial agreements, and you make sure your marriage is strong. You maintain good communication with your spouse. All kinds of things like that. They give warning signs about if a marriage is going bad. But you can't make adultery to be illegal. And so if your wife chooses to commit adultery against you, or your husband decides to commit adultery against you, well, then here's what you do. You can't prosecute them for adultery or anything like that, but you can try to rebuild the marriage. If you get a divorce, you do this or you do that and all that sort of stuff. Well, the family adultery law is designed to prevent adultery from ever happening in the first place, while at the same time getting these people who are tempted to commit adultery against their husband or commit adultery against their wife, get them to use one of the 5 legal choices, which you see here, to fix their marriage and get their marriage back to the happy marriage it used to be starting the day they got married, and do that without ever committing adultery against their family at all in the first place. This is how the family adultery law works, and nobody talks about that. Nobody says, well, let's make adultery to be completely illegal and very illegal, which the family adultery law does. Now, the family adultery law is not beating around the bush when it comes to punishment for committing adultery if your faithful spouse, the adultery victim of that personal private marriage, chooses to press charges against the adultery victimizer of that personal private marriage. Then the proof is there, the evidence is there, adultery was committed, there's no doubt about it. Then that adultery victimizer is going to be facing some serious jail time. So the family adultery law is not beating around the bush with a misdemeanor or a fine for a couple of $100s or something pathetic like that. It's applying a punishment that fits the crime. And you might say, well, does it really fit the crime? Well, that depends. How do you feel about your wife committing adultery against you? Or how do you feel about your husband committing adultery against you? Don't think about anyone else's marriage. Think about only your marriage or your future marriage that you might have someday. This is how the family adultery law works. oftentimes a lot of people, when they talk about adultery, and I see this with the social media influencers, I see this all the time. They talk about adultery in everybody else's marriage. And they say, well, if your adultery happens in your marriage, this is what you should do. Or if you want to prevent adultery from happening in your marriage, this is how you do it in your marriages. Very rarely do they ever talk about adultery in their own marriage. Now, there's some people who do, but they oftentimes will talk about it after it's happened and what they have done to recover from the victimization that they were put through by their wife who committed adultery against them, or the victimization that they were put through by their husband who committed adultery against them. Even those people never talk about, well, what should have happened is instead of their wife committing adultery against them, or instead of their husband committing adultery against them, adultery should have been illegal, really illegal. And then their husband or their wife would never have committed adultery against them in the first place. They would have gotten marriage counseling or something like that without ever having the adultery perpetrated upon their family at all. And they could have fixed the marriage without adultery ever happening, gotten it back to the happy marriage that it was starting the day they chose to marry each other. Nobody talks about that. Nobody says that. Nobody considers that idea as the best way of dealing with adultery. All these social media influencers, not just the ones I've mentioned, but so many others, all of them, they just make this assumption that adultery has got to be legal. You can't make it illegal. That's just, I don't know, forbidden or something like that. That is wrong. You can make it illegal. Under the family adultery law, you absolutely can, because the family adultery law is not the same as these previous adultery laws from the past. The family adultery law is an individual choice law. So what that means is that every individual engaged couple chooses for their personal private marriage that they're about to begin with each other, whether or not they want the family adultery law for their personal private marriage separate from everyone else's personal private marriage. And the government makes that choice for nobody. Right now, without the family adultery law available to people, they don't realize this the day they get married, but the government does decide for your marriage, whether you like it or not, that your marriage is going to be adultery legal, period, or it's going to strongly coerce you into accepting adultery as a completely legal choice in your personal private marriage, whether you want to or not. Fiancés don't realize this the day they get married. But then as their marriage continues, and after a certain number of years, they find out their husband's committing adultery against them, or they find out their wife is committing adultery against them, and they start going through the divorce process. Well, at some point during the divorce process, more than likely their lawyer is going to look at them and tell them, look, I understand you're upset that your wife has victimized you with adultery like this, and now your kids are going through a custody battle and all that kind of stuff. Or your husband has committed adultery against you like this, and now your kids are going through a custody battle and all this, that, and the other. I understand. You're upset. I get it. But as your lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, of course, but what they probably say to their client is, as your lawyer, you have to understand, adultery is not illegal. And that's when it hits these people that their marriage never belonged to them in the first place. And they don't realize it until after the fact. And now that they're going through the divorce process, they also begin to realize that not only did their marriage never belong to them in the first place, but the divorce that they're going to have is not going to belong to them either. They're not going to have any control over the divorce, or very little control. And to a very severe extent, their children will not belong to them either. It's all going to belong to the state government that they live in, that mandates adultery has to be legal, that it cannot be illegal, and that therefore the state government and the family court system that they're going through in this county, or a family court system in a different county or whatever, is just going to decide what happens to their kids, what happens to their homes, their retirement, all this, that, and the other. They realize, oh my God, I've become an asset to the state government they live in. A lot of people would say they almost feel like they become a slave to the state they live in now that they're getting divorced because they refuse to accept the severe victimization of adultery from their husband or the severe victimization of adultery from their wife. They can't accept it. So now the alternative is they lose their kids or they have to prove something to a court in order to not lose their kids. And if they can't prove something to a family court system that they're not just a good parent or a decent parent, but the better parent, then they lose everything. So the family adultery law is going to go a long way in preventing all of this kind of pain and misery. And this is what social media influencers of all kinds, they don't talk about this. They talk about, well, here's what you do now that adultery's happened. Get the right kind of lawyer, make sure you make this decision during your case, look up the state laws that you live in because they vary from one state to the next, and all this confusing, just ridiculous arguments of one type or another. And people are thinking to themselves, look, I didn't get married so that my wife could commit adultery against me and get away with it, or that my husband could commit adultery and get away with it. They got married with the understanding that the person they're getting married to is not going to victimize them with adultery under any circumstances of any kind, no matter what. And that even if the marriage starts to go bad and have, unhappy days to it, then the person they're choosing to marry will let them know. Get marriage counseling, something, anything. Use one of the 5 legal choices which you see here. So nobody's talking about this possibility of just making adultery to be illegal, and the family adultery law is by far the best way to do that because it's an individual choice law. So watch this video. Watch this video. Think about it, how the 5 foundations of the family adultery law work together to prevent adultery from happening and get people with unhappy marriages of whatever reason into a marriage counselor or somebody to try to fix the marriage without ever committing the victimization of adultery at all in the first place. Because once somebody commits the victimization of adultery against their wife or against their husband, against their family, a lot of people will take the point of view that for their personal private marriage, separate from everyone else's personal private marriage, it can't be fixed. That is something that is just completely unfixable. It's like a broken leg of a horse. You can't fix it. Or it's like someone who's lost a leg or an arm in some sort of an accident or something of that nature. You just can't grow it back. It's gone forever, period. So watch this video and then apply this to some of these things that people talk about on social media, all these other influencers, and how they never talk about making adultery to just be illegal. And that the family adultery law is the way to do that because the family adultery law is an individual choice law. Let me know what you think. Give me some comments. Say anything you want. Say it peacefully and non-violently. But in the comments, by all means, say, this is a great idea. The family adultery law is a great idea. Or, no, it's a bad idea. And why? Let me know. Okay, let's talk about it somewhere and get the process started. Maybe some of these other social media influencers who hear about the family adultery law, maybe they'll start talking about it too. More than likely, they have not heard about it. I'm curious to find, what do they think when they find out about the family adultery law and how it works, and they look into it some. What's their opinion? Do they think this would really work or not, and why? All right, I'll talk to you again.